Welcome to Mysteries and Crime, where we uncover the darkest corners of history's most chilling mysteries. Tonight, we revisit the Villisca Axe Murders, an unsolved nightmare that still haunts the small town of Villisca, Iowa. Here's your clue for today. What key object was left behind at the crime scene? Keep listening and see if you can solve this riddle before the end. On the night of June 9th, 1912, the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, became the setting for one of the most brutal massacres in American history. 8 people, including 6 children, were murdered in their sleep, their skulls crushed by an axe. Over a century later, the case remains unsolved. The morning of June 10th, 1912, began like any other. But when neighbor Mary Peckham noticed the usually early rising Moore family had not emerged, unease settled over her. The house was eerily silent, the curtains drawn tight. Her knocks went unanswered. Mary's concern led her to call Josiah Moore's brother Ross. When Ross arrived and unlocked the front door, nothing could have prepared him for the horror inside. The house reeked of death. The first room revealed an unthinkable sight. 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, bludgeoned beyond recognition in the downstairs bedroom. Ross rushed out, barely able to speak, and alerted Villisca's town marshal, Hank Horton. Inside, the scene grew worse. Josiah and his wife Sarah lay in their blood-soaked bed, their faces brutally disfigured. Their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were found in the adjacent room, all slaughtered in their sleep. Shock rippled through the town. How could an entire family plus 2 guests be slain so silently in the dead of night? The doors had been locked, the killer had vanished, and the town of Villisca would never be the same again. The Moore family was well known and well liked in Villisca. Josiah, a successful businessman, ran a local hardware store. He was a respected community figure, known for his generosity and kindness. His wife, Sarah, was devoted to her family, active in their local church, and often organized Sunday school gatherings. Their 4 children, Herman, age 11, Catherine, age 10, Boyd, age 7, and Paul, age 5, were playful, energetic, and deeply cherished by their parents. The Moore household was filled with warmth and laughter, making the events of June 10th even more horrifying. That fateful night, the Moores hosted 2 young guests, Lena Stillinger, age 12, and her sister Ina, age 8. The Stillinger sisters had spent the day at church with the Moores and were invited to stay the night. Their parents, unaware of the horror that awaited them, agreed. None of them would wake again. Each victim had been struck in the head with an axe, their skulls shattered beyond recognition. Josiah, it appeared, was attacked with the most force, his face so brutally bludgeoned that his eyes were missing. What's even more disturbing, some of the victims appeared to have been covered with clothing or blankets after they were killed, as if the murderer couldn't bear to look at what they had done. But was this a sign of remorse, or something more sinister? Despite the brutality of the crime, no one saw or heard a thing. The locked house suggested that the killer, or killers, had planned their escape meticulously. Several suspects emerged in the years following the murders, each with a compelling yet incomplete case against them. One of the first suspects was Frank F. Jones, a powerful local businessman. Josiah Moore had once worked for Jones, but left to start his own successful company, taking valuable clients with him. Some believe Jones harbored a bitter grudge and may have hired a hitman, possibly William Mansfield, to carry out the murders. However, No solid evidence linked Jones or Mansfield to the crime. Then there was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister with a disturbing past. Kelly had been in town that night, attending the same church event as the Moore family. He was known for his bizarre, erratic behavior, and, most chillingly, had a reported obsession with the case. Years later, he even confessed to the murders, only to later recant. His confession was riddled with inconsistencies, and he was ultimately acquitted. A more sinister theory pointed to a random serial killer. Similar axe murders occurred in other Midwestern towns during that era, leading some to believe the Villisca killings were part of a larger spree. If that was true, then the killer may have never been caught. So, was it a revenge killing, a deranged outsider, or someone hiding in plain sight? The night of June 9th, 1912, began like any other in Villisca. After an evening church event, the Moore family and their young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, returned home, unaware that a monster lurked in the shadows. At some point after midnight, the killer, or killers, entered the house. There were no signs of forced entry. Some believe the murderer had been hiding inside, waiting patiently for the household to fall into a deep sleep. Others speculate they entered through an unlocked door, silent as the night. Once inside, the perpetrator retrieved an axe, believed to be Josiah Moore's own, and methodically made their way to the master bedroom. Josiah and Sarah Moore were the first victims. The attacker swung the axe with terrifying force, caving in their skulls with blunt, merciless strikes. Blood splattered the ceiling, the walls, the bed, evidence of a frenzied, brutal assault. Next, the killer moved to the children's room. One by one, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were bludgeoned to death, never waking to see the horror unfold. The sheer savagery suggested personal rage, but the eerily systematic approach hinted at cold, calculated intent. The Stillinger sisters, sleeping downstairs, were the final victims. Ina was struck first, likely never realizing what was happening. But Lena, her body told a different story. Unlike the others, she was found in an unusual position, her nightgown pulled up, her arms raised in defense. A gash on her arm suggested she had woken up, perhaps even fought back in her last moments. Then, the killer did something even more disturbing. They covered the faces of the victims with blankets or pieces of clothing, as if shielding themselves from the aftermath of their own carnage. And stranger still, the murderer took their time. Bloody fingerprints on a kerosene lamp suggested they moved cautiously, methodically. The lamp was adjusted to a dim glow, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Before leaving, they placed the axe in the guest room, wiping it down, but leaving telltale smears of blood. Inexplicably, they also covered every mirror in the house and left a slab of bacon, yes, bacon, on the floor near the weapon. Why? Was it a twisted ritual, a symbol, or the work of a mind unraveling in the aftermath of unspeakable violence? Despite the horror, no one in town heard a thing. No screams, no struggle. The Moore house sat in silence as the killer vanished into the night, leaving behind a crime scene that would baffle investigators for more than a century. And the most haunting question remains: did the killer return to normal life that morning, blending seamlessly into the very town they had just terrorized? The Villisca Axe Murders sent shockwaves through the town, and local law enforcement faced a daunting task: catching a killer who had left no clear trace. Town Marshal Hank Horton was the first officer on the scene. He quickly called for assistance, but the crime scene was compromised almost immediately. In an era before forensic preservation, Curious townspeople wandered into the house, tracking evidence away with their footprints and contaminating the scene. Despite these challenges, authorities pieced together a chilling timeline. Based on the severity of the wounds, they determined the murders occurred sometime after midnight. The absence of forced entry suggested the killer was either known to the victims or had been inside the house, waiting. Multiple suspects emerged, but the case was plagued by inconsistencies. With no conclusive fingerprints, no surviving witnesses, and no way to track the murder weapon beyond Josiah's own axe, the investigation hit a frustrating standstill. Forensic science in 1912 was rudimentary at best. Blood typing was in its infancy, and fingerprint analysis, while available, was not widely used in small-town investigations. Authorities attempted to analyze the crime scene, but their efforts were hindered by contamination. Over 100 onlookers had trampled through the house before it was officially sealed, leaving crucial evidence lost forever. The murder weapon, Josiah Moore's axe, was found near the Stillinger sisters' room. Though it was wiped down, traces of blood and hair remained. But without forensic technology, investigators could not determine if the evidence belonged to the victims or the killer. In later years, modern forensic experts revisited the case using criminal profiling and behavioral analysis. Some suggested the killer was familiar with the Moores, while others believed the crime matched a pattern of similar murders across the Midwest. Panic spread through Villisca like wildfire. A once peaceful town had become the site of an unspeakable massacre, and fear took hold of its citizens. Families locked their doors, something many had never done before. Guns were kept within arm's reach, and no one trusted their neighbors. Rumors swirled. Was the killer still among them? Had they already struck elsewhere? Some townspeople claimed to have seen a mysterious figure lurking near the Moore house that night, but with no solid evidence, the fear remained just that. Fear. Life in Villisca changed forever. The sense of safety the town once knew was gone. News of the Villisca Axe murders spread far beyond Iowa. Newspapers across the country covered the grisly details, fueling public fascination and hysteria. Sensational headlines painted the crime as a story of horror. Midnight massacre in Iowa and whole family slain by madman. Some papers speculated about satanic rituals. Others accused local politicians of covering up the truth. The pressure on law enforcement intensified as the nation demanded answers. But as time passed, the case faded from the front pages, replaced by newer tragedies. Yet, even over a century later, the Villisca Axe murders remain a chilling mystery, one the world has never forgotten. Over the years, multiple theories emerged about who committed the Villisca Axe murders, but none led to a definitive answer. One of the most popular theories implicated Frank F. Jones, a powerful Villisca businessman. Josiah Moore had once worked for Jones, but left to start his own hardware business, taking major clients with him. Many believe Jones had hired William Mansfield, a known serial killer, to exact revenge. However, Mansfield was later cleared due to an alibi. Then there was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had attended the same church event as the Moores that night. Kelly was obsessed with the murders, writing letters about them and even confessing, only to later recant. Some believed his confession was coerced, and he was ultimately acquitted. Other theories suggested a random serial killer, as similar axe murders occurred across the Midwest around the same time. Could Villisca's killer have been part of a larger spree? Despite multiple suspects, no one was ever convicted of the Villisca Axe murders. The closest the case came to a resolution was the trial of Reverend George Kelly in 1917. Kelly, known for his erratic behavior and obsession with the crime, confessed to the killings. However, his confession was inconsistent and possibly forced under pressure. His first trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial resulted in his acquittal. Meanwhile, the case against William Mansfield fell apart when he produced a solid alibi. And despite speculation surrounding Frank F. Jones, no concrete evidence tied him to the crime. In the end, the case went cold. The town of Villisca was left with more questions than answers, and a lingering fear that the killer had escaped justice forever. More than a century later, the Villisca Axe murders remain one of America's most haunting, unsolved crimes. Why was the Moore family targeted? Was the killer a drifter, moving from town to town? Or was it someone they knew, someone who walked among them in broad daylight? And then there's the most chilling question of all. Did the murderer kill again? With no forensic evidence, no eyewitness accounts, and no confession that held up in court, we may never know the truth. But the house still stands, a silent witness to a night of unimaginable horror. Some say the spirits of the Moors remain, waiting for justice. The Villisca Axe murders changed the town forever. Once a peaceful, tight-knit community, Villisca became infamous as the site of one of the most brutal crimes in history. Fear replaced trust. Beyond Villisca, the case reshaped investigative practices, highlighting the need for forensic preservation. It also fueled America's fascination with true crime, inspiring books, documentaries, and even paranormal investigations. Today, the Villisca House is a tourist attraction, but for some, it remains more than just a historical site. It's a crime scene, one that still whispers secrets from the past. As we close this chapter, one question remains. What key object was left behind at the crime scene? Did you catch the clue? What key object was left behind at the crime scene? Leave your answer in the comments and join us next time as we unravel another chilling mystery. As always, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe.